You know what your problem is? You've always been too independent, too much in your own world. Your sister needs more from this family than you do. That's what my mother said to me on the phone the night after I drove 4 hours home for Thanksgiving. 4 hours there, 4 hours back, no leftovers, no goodbye. Just me, my coat, and the particular silence that settles inside a car when a person realizes their entire family just told them, out loud, in front of a table full of people, that they were never really the daughter they wanted. I'm going to tell you what happened, all of it, because I have spent a long time making peace with a story I used to be ashamed to tell, and I'm done being quiet about it. My name doesn't matter for the purposes of this. What matters is that for most of my adult life, I was the daughter who showed up. I was the one who answered the phone at 7 in the morning when something was wrong. I was the one who called back when someone called and didn't leave a message, because I had learned that a missed call with no message usually meant something that the caller wasn't sure how to ask for yet. I drove home for every holiday, including the minor ones that most people treat as optional, the ones where you call and say Happy Easter and go back to your life. I didn't do that. I drove 4, sometimes 5 hours each way, because showing up in person felt like what you did for your family. I had decided this early. It was not a decision I revisited. I sent money when things got tight. I covered birthdays, which in practical terms meant I would spend time I did not have researching what someone wanted, ordering it, wrapping it, writing a card, and either shipping it or carrying it home on the next visit. I mailed groceries during the stretch when my parents were between reliable income periods. I paid phone bills, not mine, theirs, and sometimes Renee's. I handled insurance renewals because nobody else in my family was comfortable with the process. So I would get on the phone with whoever needed to be called and talk them through it or talk to them on their behalf. I explained medical forms and researched specialists and made phone calls ahead of appointments so the person going to the appointment would walk in already knowing what to expect. I formatted resumes that hadn't been updated in a decade. I proofread cover letters for jobs Renee applied for and sometimes didn't get and occasionally didn't show up to interview for. I was, in the clearest possible terms, the scaffolding that held parts of my family's life upright. And scaffolding, as anyone who has worked around a construction site knows, is only noticeable when it isn't there. I work in logistics. Specifically, I manage supply chain operations for a mid-sized company, which means that professionally, I am trained to do 2 things: anticipate failure points before they become crises, and build systems that absorb disruption without collapsing. I am good at my job. I have been promoted 3 times. I have a team under me that I am genuinely proud of, and a professional reputation I built from scratch in a field that is less welcoming to people who look like me than it should be. I say none of this to perform competence. I say it because for years, my family's operating assumption was that I was doing fine actually, and therefore needed less. That my life was somehow lower stakes than everyone else's. That my ability to manage difficult things without visibly falling apart meant I had endless bandwidth to manage everyone else's difficult things too. I bought my first apartment at 26. I had saved for 2 years to do it, working through a period that included 1 pay cut, 1 unexpected car repair, and 3 months of eating rice and frozen vegetables with the enthusiasm of someone who has decided they like it. I did not tell my family how tight it was during that time. I did not want them to worry, and honestly, I did not want them to call me with their problems while I was quietly white-knuckling my way through my own. I made it. I signed the papers. I stood in my empty apartment on move-in day and felt something I can only describe as earned. My sister Renee was 23 at the time, still living at home. That was fine. People take different timelines, and Renee's timeline had always run a few years behind mine, in ways that I took as personality rather than pattern. She had left a college program partway through and was figuring out her next step. She was creative, funny, charismatic in social settings, and almost completely uninterested in anything that required sustained administrative effort. I loved her. I found her exhausting in the particular way you find someone exhausting when you can see their potential clearly and they seem constitutionally uninterested in accessing it. But I was not measuring us against each other. I was just living my life. What I did not know, because nobody told me, was that Renee had been constructing a different version of our story for years. A version I would not discover until I was 32 years old, sitting at a Thanksgiving table, passing the sweet potatoes, watching my mother announce to 12 people, 12 I counted afterward, with the clinical detachment of someone in moderate shock, that Renee was the real daughter, the one who had stayed, the one who understood what family actually meant. I kept passing the sweet potatoes. I want you to understand what that moment felt like from the inside, because it would be easy to imagine that I stood up and made a speech, that I produced receipts, that I said something devastating and precise, and walked out to the sound of silence. I did not. What I did was set the serving dish down on the table with a care that, in retrospect, I find almost comical. I was careful not to spill anything, even in that moment, and I did not say a word. I listened to my aunt laugh too quickly, the way people laugh when they are trying to signal that something is not as terrible as it sounds. I watched my cousin become very interested in a particular spot on her plate. I saw my dad turn his face toward the wall, the way he has done my entire life when he does not want to be asked where he stands. My mother, for her part, continued speaking, elaborating on the theme, saying something about presence, about availability, about what it means to really be there for people. She was not looking at me when she said it. I folded my napkin. I set it on the table beside my plate. I pushed my chair back slowly. I walked to the bedroom where everyone's coats were piled on the bed, and I found mine near the bottom, and I put it on, and I picked up my bag, and I walked down the hall, and through the living room, and out the front door, and I pulled it shut behind me with the smallest possible click. Nobody came after me. That surprised me in the moment. Afterward, it didn't. The drive home was 4 hours in the dark. My phone was face up on the passenger seat, and I watched it light up 47 minutes in, my mother's name, bright on the screen. I watched it ring. I watched it stop. I turned the radio on. A song I didn't know. I turned it off again. She called again at the 2-hour mark. By then, I was somewhere in the middle of a stretch of highway where the exit signs come infrequently and the darkness is almost total, and something about that felt right for the moment. I picked up. "You know what your problem is," she started, and then she told me, "Too independent, too much in my own world. Your sister needs more from this family than you do." "I know," I said, and I hung up. I want to talk about that sentence for a second, because it matters. I know. 2 words. Not defensive, not explanatory, not escalating. Just an acknowledgement of the dynamic of the thing she was actually saying underneath the thing she was saying. And a door shut. I had never spoken to my mother that way before. For most of my life, when she said things like that, I apologized. I explained. I tried to make her understand my perspective. I offered more. This time, I just said, "I know," and ended the call. And the strange thing is that it felt like power, not cruelty. The most controlled I had felt all day. That was the first time I used a sentence as a full stop instead of a door. To understand what happened at Thanksgiving, you have to understand the 6 years that came before it, because the comment did not arrive from nowhere. It was the visible tip of something that had been growing underground for a long time, fed by money and silence and a family's collective need to keep a comfortable story intact. Renee was 21 when she quit her third job in 8 months. I remember it clearly because I was in the middle of a challenging quarter at work, managing a supplier crisis that had me on calls until 10 at night. And she called me on a Tuesday while I was trying to finish a report that was due the next morning. She was crying. Not the low, steady kind of crying that means someone is genuinely in grief, but the kind that rises and falls in waves and can go on indefinitely if the right person is on the other end of the line. I was the right person. I set my report aside and I listened for 40 minutes. Then she told me she needed $700 to cover rent because she didn't want to tell our parents she'd lost another job. She was embarrassed, she said. I said yes. I transferred the money that night before I went to bed. She sent me a voice note that said, "You're literally my favorite person. I love you so much." And then the loan was simply never spoken of again for 6 months, at which point she told me, with genuine apology, but also a kind of airy acceptance, that the situation was what it was, that she'd had to essentially start over financially and couldn't pay it back. "That's okay," I said. I said that a lot. "That's okay. It's fine. Don't worry about it." I genuinely meant it in most cases, and I also know now that meaning it and it actually being okay are not the same thing. $700 to me at 28 was real money. Money I had worked for. Money I had made choices to have available. I gave it without hesitation because she was my sister and she needed it, and I had it. I expected, perhaps naively, that this would be part of a relationship of mutual regard, that there was a reciprocity operating somewhere, even if it wasn't financial. There was not. Over the years that followed, I said okay to a lot of things. My mother calling to say Renee was struggling with motivation, and maybe I could talk to her, since she seemed to respond to me in ways she didn't respond to them. I said okay, and I called Renee, and I spent 90 minutes talking her through a plan that had a clear shape, that made use of what she was actually good at, that accounted for her specific situation. She was engaged during the call. She said she felt better. She said I always knew what to say. She did not follow the plan. I know this because I checked in 2 weeks later and we had a conversation that required me to pretend I had not heard the first one. I said okay when Renee needed a reference letter for an apartment she was trying to rent. I spent an evening writing it, a genuinely good letter, because I could not bring myself to write a mediocre one, even in a situation that did not have a lot of honest material to work with. I framed her qualities carefully. I emphasized the things that were real. I submitted it, and she got the apartment and called me and said I was amazing, and the call was warm and genuine, and I was glad I had helped. I said okay when my dad called to tell me Renee's car had broken down and the repair estimate was $1,200, and they were trying not to touch a fund they had been carefully building for other purposes. I asked a few questions. I thought about it for perhaps a full minute, which was about 59 seconds longer than I had thought about the 700. Then I transferred the 1,200. When I followed up 3 months later to ask whether they wanted to discuss any kind of repayment arrangement, I was deliberate about framing it as a question, not a demand. My mother said something that I have thought about many times since. "We didn't think you needed it back. You're doing so well. You're doing so well." I want to stay with that phrase for a moment because I think it is worth examining carefully. "You're doing so well," spoken with warmth, with what sounded like genuine admiration, possibly with some pride. And underneath all of that, an explanation for why my needs were optional, why my resources were available for redistribution, why the transaction was closed without discussion. I was doing well, therefore what I had was surplus. Renee was not doing well, therefore what she needed was urgent. This logic had been running in the background of our family for years, so smoothly and for so long that it had become invisible. What my family did not fully account for was that I was doing well because I had decided to do well. It was not accidental. I was not lucky in the structural sense. I had worked 50-hour weeks for years. I had not taken a vacation in 3 years at one point. Not a real vacation. Not the kind where you turn your out of office on and actually stop checking your phone. I drove a 12-year-old car with a driver's side window that stuck halfway down until I had saved enough to replace it. I cooked at home. I wore the same professional wardrobe for 4 years and rotated it carefully and called that a strategy. I made financial decisions most people my age were not making because I did not have the safety net that a functional family relationship is supposed to provide. And I knew this instinctively, though I couldn't have articulated it then the way I can now, that if I fell, the people who would be called upon to catch me were already busy catching Renee. I built myself a floor with my own hands and my own time, and my family had decided that floor was community property. What I did not know, what I would not find out until a December month 3 weeks after the Thanksgiving incident, was the rest of the story, the part that had been happening in rooms I wasn't in. Renee's friend Marissa contacted me. We were not close. She had been a fixture in the background of family events and had always been pleasant enough. But she reached out through Instagram with a message that was careful and deliberate in its phrasing, the kind of message you draft and redraft before you send it. She said she had been sitting with something for a while and she thought I should know. I called her instead of typing back. She answered immediately, which told me she had been waiting. Renee had been telling people, friends, family members, Marissa herself, that I did not really help the family, that I sent money occasionally, but always in a way that made them feel guilty for needing it, that I was difficult and judgmental and held my success over people, that I had always been cold, even when they were growing up, even when there were moments where closeness might have been possible, and that was why nobody ever really knew how to reach me. That the reason I seemed so put together was because I did not care about anyone other than myself, and caring about other people was costly, and I had simply opted out of that cost. I sat with that for a long time, literally. I was in my car in a grocery store parking lot. I had been mid-errand when the voice note with the details came through, and I had pulled over because I could not keep driving while absorbing what I was hearing. And I sat there for roughly 20 minutes in the particular stillness that arrives when something you had half suspected turns out to be entirely, carefully, purposefully true. There was a moment somewhere in that parking lot where I thought, of course, not as devastation, but as recognition. The kind you feel when a shape you've been staring at suddenly resolves into what it actually is. The way my mother had occasionally looked at me with something like discomfort when I described a professional accomplishment. The way certain conversations with Renee had an undertow I couldn't quite identify, a friction that had no clear origin. The way the Thanksgiving comment had not seemed to surprise anyone at the table, the way it had surprised me. The way my father had known the sentiment had been building and had found ways not to tell me. All of it arranged itself into a pattern I could finally read clearly. She had been rewriting me for years. The generosity had become performance. The distance I maintained because I had a full life and a demanding career, and I was not physically in the same city, not because I did not love them, had become evidence of a character defect. My success had been reframed as a symptom of selfishness, as though the work I had done to build something stable was itself proof that I had stolen time and care from people who deserved it. And my family, or at least some of them, or maybe all of them, I would never fully know, had found this version easier to hold than the truth. The truth was that I had done nearly everything asked of me, and some things that were not asked, but that I saw needed doing, and had received in return a narrative that made me the villain. The truth was sitting in a spreadsheet I had not looked at in its totality until that night, when I drove home from the parking lot and opened my laptop and scrolled back to the beginning. I have to tell you about the spreadsheet. I tracked my finances carefully. It was a professional habit that had crossed over into my personal life, the way occupational behaviors tend to do when they become deeply ingrained. Every time I transferred money to a family member, I logged it the same way I logged any expense: date, amount, recipient, purpose, short note. I was not building a case. I was not doing it out of resentment or with any thought that I would one day produce it. I logged it the way I log my rent and my utilities and my grocery runs, because I was a person who kept records, and keeping records had served me well. That December evening, I opened the spreadsheet and started at the first entry, 7 years back, $43,200. I went through the numbers twice, because the first time I thought I had added wrong. I had not. $43,200 across 7 years. Direct transfers, covered phone bills, car repairs, rent assistance. The Christmas I had bought most of the gifts because my parents told me they couldn't afford it. The 3 times I had quietly transferred grocery money without mentioning it because I knew they were embarrassed to ask. Some of those transactions I had half forgotten. The total I had never looked at. In the same 7 years, my income had been sufficient but not extravagant. I had made the $43,000 available through the choices I described earlier. The sacrificed vacations, the old car, the rotated wardrobe, the lunches at my desk. It had not been surplus. I had made it surplus by deciding other things were less important. I took a screenshot of the spreadsheet. I did not send it to anyone. I sat with it on my phone screen for a few minutes looking at the number. I needed it to be real and visible and finite, not just a weight I had been carrying without knowing its exact measure. $43,200. The weight of being the scaffolding translated into a number. It looked different that way. It looked like evidence. Then I called my father. He is a quiet man, my father. He is the kind of person who experiences conflict the way some people experience cold water. He will endure it briefly and then move as far away from it as possible. I do not say this as an insult. I love my father. I understand him. I also know that his conflict avoidance has costs, and that some of those costs have been paid by me. His silence at the Thanksgiving table was not neutral. Silence in the presence of a cruelty directed at someone you love is a choice, even when it does not feel like one. He picked up on the second ring. I need to have an honest conversation with you, I said, and I need you to actually be in it. A pause. My father communicates partly in pauses. Okay, he said. Did you know what Mom was going to say at Thanksgiving? What she said about Renee? Another pause, longer. She'd been saying things like that around the house for a while. For how long? A while. Maybe the last couple of years. Getting more. And you didn't think to say anything to me. I didn't think she'd say it in front of everyone. But you knew the way she felt. Silence, which was its own answer, the clearest one he could give me. Okay, I said. Thank you. And then I told him I loved him, because I did, because none of this had changed that. And I told him I was going to be making some changes going forward, and I hoped he would understand them, even if understanding them was difficult. He asked what kind of changes. The kind where I stopped being the scaffolding. I said. He didn't know what that meant. I did not explain it. Some things are best learned through their effects, rather than their definitions. The changes were not theatrical. I want to be precise about this because I think there is a version of this kind of story that people expect to be explosive. The confrontation scene, the speech, the evidence produced at last, the moment of catharsis where everything is said that has been unsaid and the scales tip publicly back into balance. I did not have that story. Mine was quieter and in its own way more complete. I stopped sending money, not with a declaration, not with a letter explaining the $43,000 and the narrative and the spreadsheet and the parking lot and all of it. I simply did not send money the next time my mother called to say Renee was behind on her utilities and things were tight. I listened to the full explanation. I expressed sympathy that sounded genuine because it was genuine. Being done with a dynamic does not mean you stop caring about the people in it. Then I said I was sure things would work out, and I got off the phone. My mother called back within 40 minutes to clarify. She used the word urgent. I said I understood, and that I believed in their ability to navigate it. She was confused. I could hear the confusion in the texture of her silence, in the slight recalibration happening in real time at the other end of the line. This was new behavior from a person she had understood to be reliably available. She did not have a script for it. The second time it happened, a few weeks later, Renee called directly. She was upset in the way she was upset when things were not going her way. Elevated, slightly accusatory, with an undertone suggesting that my behavior was the problem rather than her situation. She asked why I was being like this. I asked what like this meant. She said distant and cold, 2 words I had apparently always been, based on what Marissa had told me, which made the accusation oddly clarifying. She was not describing a change in me. She was describing what she had always told people I was. The accusation was prepared. I told her I was glad we were talking, that I loved her, and that I hoped things looked up. I did not send money. The third time, my mother told me I was being selfish. That word, the word I had apparently always been, according to Renee's version of me that she had been distributing for years. The word my family had chosen over the truth, over the $43,000, over 7 years of showing up and following through and saying, okay, selfish. It landed differently than it would have a year earlier. A year earlier, it would have found something soft in me and hooked into it. The guilt reflex that had been trained into me over years of being the capable one, the reliable one, the one who could handle more. That reflex is real, and it does not disappear overnight. I am not going to pretend that hearing my mother call me selfish was nothing. It was something. It sat in my chest for a few minutes like a stone. But I also had the screenshot on my phone. I understand why it feels that way, I said. I hope things work out. And I meant it. And I hung up. The 6 months that followed were the part of the story I think about most when I try to be honest about what this actually cost me, because they were not triumphant. I did not emerge from that Thanksgiving dinner and immediately feel free. Freedom was not an event. It was a process, and it was a slow and sometimes unglamorous one, with long stretches of ordinary Tuesday mornings where I had simply made a decision and was now living inside its consequences without any guarantee that it had been the right one. There were calls I did not answer. There were family events that happened without me. I know this from the photographs that appeared eventually on social media. The cousin's birthday dinner, the Easter gathering, a summer cookout. And the absence felt strange in a way I was not always able to name precisely. Not quite guilt, not quite sadness, something adjacent to both. The awareness that there was a life happening in a place I had decided to step back from, and that stepping back required accepting that the stepping back was real. I went through a few weeks of second guessing myself. Maybe the 43,000 didn't matter in the way I was making it matter. Maybe I was being rigid. Maybe the right thing was to call, to explain everything, to give my family the chance to see what I had seen and respond to it differently. I sat with this possibility seriously. I wanted to be honest with myself about whether what I was doing was strength or avoidance dressed up as strength. What I came back to every time was the spreadsheet, not as a weapon, but as a compass. Not what I was owed, but what was true. The number was real. The years were real. The narrative Renee had been building was real. And the Thanksgiving comment, delivered in front of 12 people, was real. A family that knew and did not correct it, that allowed it to be said, that laughed nervously and looked at walls. That was real too. I had not imagined it. I had not misread it, and I could not unknow it. There was a Sunday in February when I cooked a full meal for myself. Roast chicken, the kind that takes actual time, that you baste and rotate and watch. The kind I had never bothered with during the years when my weekends felt too scattered, too interrupted, too full of calls and logistics and little emergencies. I made it with real attention, which is the only way it works. I set it on my own table, in my own apartment, alone. I thought about what my family was probably doing in that moment. My mother watching something in the living room, her feet tucked under her on the couch the way she always sat. My dad half asleep in his chair with something on in the background, technically present in the room without being quite there. Renee, wherever she was now, in the apartment with the boyfriend, building whatever version of her life she was currently building. The particular texture of that house on a winter Sunday, the smell of it, the sounds, the way the light came through the kitchen window at a certain angle in the late afternoon, which I knew well enough to reconstruct from memory in complete detail. I felt something that was not quite grief and not quite peace, but existed in the precise space between them. Not the absence of feeling, but the presence of something that did not need to be resolved to be survivable. I let it be there. I ate my dinner. I washed my plate and my pan and dried them and put them away. I put my coat on and I went for a long walk, the kind where you are not going anywhere specifically, just moving through cold air until something shifts. I did not call anyone. I went to bed. I went to work the next morning. I answered my emails. I had a productive week. This is how you live through a decision that is correct but difficult, not through resolution or catharsis or a single defining moment where everything becomes clear, but through the accumulation of ordinary days in which you keep making the same choice, quietly, without applause. My Aunt Patricia reached out in March. She was my mother's older sister and had been at the Thanksgiving table. She was the one who had laughed too quickly in that first terrible second of silence. She texted to ask if I would have coffee with her, and I said yes without hesitating. I had always liked Patricia in the way you like someone who seems to see more clearly than the people around her, while also, for reasons of loyalty or love or self-preservation, choosing not to say so. She told me that things at home had been difficult since I had stepped back, that my mother had tried to get Renee to take on more of a support role, practically and financially, and that Renee had responded by accelerating plans to move in with a boyfriend, which had reduced the household's overall stability. My dad was managing, my mother was managing, but the house, she said, felt different. She misses you, Patricia said, meaning my mother. I know, I said. I miss her too. Then why? Because missing someone and allowing someone to treat you badly are different things, I said. And I think you know that. I think you've known for a long time that things weren't right. The comment at Thanksgiving wasn't a one-time thing, Patricia. You know that. She looked at her coffee cup. It was a specific kind of look, the look of someone releasing a long-held breath. I know, she said, not defending anyone, just acknowledging, just letting the truth take up the space it deserved. We talked for 2 hours. She told me things I had not known, about my mother's guilt around Renee's choices over the years, guilt that had apparently been accumulating for a long time over things that predated anything I had been aware of, about the way that guilt had made her compensatory toward Renee in ways she probably hadn't fully examined, because examining them would have required naming things that were easier to manage by not naming. Patricia was careful as she told me this. She was not making excuses, and she seemed to want me to understand that. She was offering me context, the kind that does not absolve but does illuminate. Your mother loves you, she said, but I think she assumed you didn't need it shown to you the same way. You were always so self-sufficient. She read that as not needing what Renee needed. Self-sufficiency is not the same as not needing things, I said. I know, Patricia said. I don't think she knew that. There is a difference between understanding why something happened and accepting that it was okay. I can understand that my mother's love for Renee was tangled up with guilt and worry in ways that distorted her perception over time. And I can also understand that the distortion had real cost for me. And I can hold both of those things simultaneously without needing one of them to cancel out the other. This was something I had to practice. It did not come naturally, but I got better at it. I drove home from that coffee, feeling something loosened in my chest, not resolved, not healed, just given a little more room to breathe. By summer, my mother had called twice, with the kind of calls that were noticeably different from the earlier ones. No request embedded inside them, no urgency being managed, no version of you're not doing, enough operating just below the surface. These calls opened with I've been thinking. They had pauses in them that were space rather than pressure. The first one, I mostly listened. The second one, I spoke more freely. She did not apologize in the way I had once imagined she might. There was no clean moment, no letter composed with care, no scene where she held my hand and named every specific wrong thing and asked for forgiveness with the precision the situation technically warranted. That is not who she is, and at a certain point I had to decide whether I needed her to be that person or whether I could work with who she actually was. What she said over the phone on a Tuesday while I was eating lunch at my desk was this: I don't think I've seen you clearly. I think I made it easy on myself to see Renee one way and you another, and I don't think that was right. It was not everything. It was something real. It was, from her, a significant thing. I told her I appreciated it. I told her I loved her. I told her that things between us were going to be different going forward, and that different didn't mean gone, but it did mean changed, and that I needed her to sit with what that meant, rather than try to return us to the shape we'd had before. She said she would try. I believed her the way you believe someone who is genuinely working against the gravity of old habits, partially with clear eyes. We have been rebuilding slowly and imperfectly since then. There are conversations that still require care. There are moments where the old patterns try to reassert themselves. I say things gently but plainly, and she listens better than she used to, and I try to give her the credit that represents. It is not the relationship I might have drawn up from scratch. It is a real one, which is messier and more valuable. Renee and I have not spoken. That is more her choice than mine, though I will acknowledge that I have not pushed hard for contact. There is a version of this story where I reach out and try to have the full conversation, where I bring the spreadsheet and the parking lot and Marissa's voice notes and everything, and I lay it all out on a table and say, this is what was real. I have considered that conversation. I know what it would require, not just courage, which I have, but a willingness to engage with someone who has a significant investment in a version of events that does not include her as someone who took anything from anyone. I don't know that I have the reserves for it yet. Maybe someday. Not yet. And I am making peace with the fact that not yet and never are different things, and that I am allowed to live in the space between them. What I want to say to you, what I actually want you to hear, if you are sitting somewhere recognizing your own life in the details of mine, is that the hardest part of this was not the leaving. It was not the not sending money, not the unanswered phone calls, not even the Thanksgiving table itself. The hardest part was the middle, the long, unheroic middle, where you have done the right thing and it does not feel triumphant. It feels like a Tuesday in February where you cooked yourself a chicken and sat alone and missed people who hurt you and wondered in the small hours whether you had made the right call. That part is real. I want you to know that it is real and normal, and it does not mean you got it wrong. Making a good decision does not mean the consequences of it are painless. Choosing yourself is not the same as making everything easy. There is a version of this story that social media tells where the boundary is set, and immediately the sun comes out and you feel amazing, and the toxic people crumble and the lesson arrives gift wrapped. That is not the version I lived, and I suspect it is not the version you would live either. The real version is longer and more honest and ultimately more useful, because it doesn't leave out the parts where clarity and grief exist in the same body at the same time. But I also want to tell you what comes after the middle, because there is an after, and it matters. I took a vacation this past spring, a real one, 11 days in Portugal, which I had been telling myself I would do for 4 years. Every year, something else was more important or more urgent or more deserving of the money and the time. The money needed to go somewhere. I couldn't be unreachable. I'd do it next year. I went alone. I booked a small apartment near the old part of Lisbon, and I walked for 3 or 4 hours every day, through streets that had no relationship to my life, past things I had no context for, into that particular freedom of being a person in a place where nobody knows anything about you. I ate good food. I sat in the sun. I called no one unless I wanted to, and I rarely wanted to, and that was fine. There was an afternoon, a Wednesday, midweek, when most people were somewhere being productive, where I sat at a cafe with a coffee and a pastry and the sound of the street, and I felt something I had not felt in a long time. I have turned this feeling over in my mind since, trying to name it accurately. What it felt like was permission. Permission to exist as a complete person. Permission to spend the money I had earned on the life I was actually living, rather than on the emergencies of people who had a complicated story about who I was. Permission to let the people I love figure out their own things. Permission to stop being the scaffolding for structures that had, for years, been presenting themselves to the world as if they had stood up on their own. I sat there for a long time. I ordered another coffee. I watched the street. I was happy in a way that had nothing to do with resolution or triumph or justice. Just the quiet, undramatic happiness of being a person who knows who she is, sitting in the sun, with nowhere she urgently needed to be. I came home tanned and rested, and with a slightly different relationship to the question of what I owed people and what I owed myself. My apartment looked good to me in a new way, not just a place I slept and worked and stored my things, but a place I had chosen actively with my own decisions over time, and which reflected something real about who I was and what I valued. My job felt purposeful in the way it had when I first got promoted and had not yet let the grind make it feel routine. I had perspective on it again, which turns out to be the thing you lose when you never stop long enough to gain it back. My friendships were the thing I was most surprised by. I had been, I'll admit now with some embarrassment, a friend who was physically and emotionally available in proportion to how much crisis was happening elsewhere in my life. When things with my family were demanding, I was less present in my friendships, not because I cared less, but because there was a finite amount of me and most of it was going somewhere that had a louder claim on it. I had friends who had stayed anyway, who had been patient in the way that good people sometimes are when they understand that someone they like is caught up in something complicated. I invested in those friendships differently after Portugal. They felt warmer and more mutual, more like what relationships are supposed to feel like when both people are genuinely glad the other exists and neither of them is keeping score or managing a narrative. I have started using my Sundays differently. Long runs in the morning when the streets are still quiet, cooking things that take real time because I enjoy the process, not because anyone needs feeding on a schedule. Bad television committed to with full attention and no guilt. Books I have been meaning to read for years, finally read. Small things, ordinary things, the kind of things that seem trivial in isolation, but which, accumulated across enough Sundays, become a life that is recognizably, undeniably yours. $43,200, 7 years, 11 days in Portugal. The math eventually starts to work in your favor. I think about that Thanksgiving sometimes, not with the bitterness I might have expected. I passed through bitterness a while ago, and what's on the other side of it is something clearer and less combustible. I think about it with a kind of wry, honest wonder at the precision of moments like that. The way dynamics that have been true for years will sometimes wait, with patience, for the exact right moment to announce themselves in a room. My mother, at the head of a table full of people, saying the things she had been building to for years, whether she knew it or not, in front of 12 witnesses and a dish of sweet potatoes and my cousin's downcast eyes and my father's careful study of the wall, and me folding my napkin, not responding, not explaining, not reaching for the right words to make things better or to make her see. Just folding a napkin and getting my coat and walking out into the cold and driving 4 hours home in the dark, alone, with the particular clarity that comes when something you have been half denying to yourself becomes, at last, undeniable. I did not know in that car that I was beginning something rather than ending it. I did not know about the spreadsheet number I had never added up, or the parking lot in December, or the coffee with Patricia, or the Tuesday call that would come months later where my mother's voice would sound like someone setting something heavy down. I did not know about Portugal, or the Wednesday afternoon, or the feeling I would eventually learn to call permission. I just drove, and the highway unrolled ahead of me, dark and long and entirely mine, and I drove all the way home.